If you're a startup founder, one of your most important responsibilities is raising startup funds. You must answer important questions like, how much should you raise? When should you raise? Why should you raise funds this way? You'll also need to know what type of funds you should raise. Should you use convertible notes? Is a safe or simple agreement for future equity the right choice? Maybe you'll want to sell stock in your startup. How do you answer these questions? After decades in the startup industry, one thing we know for certain: you should not guess. The good thing is, raising startup funds is not a black art. There's no hidden mystery. In fact, fortunately for founders, there is a repeatable process. The answer is to build a startup funding strategy. I'm Sam Wong, and I've done 5 startups with 3 exits over the past 2 decades. I'm a startup CEO coach, author, and instructor for a library of startup training. Let's cover important high-level concepts on how to build a funding strategy. Let's start by looking at the timeline for the early stages of a startup. It starts with the founders evaluating whether they want to do a startup. Then they commit to the company and go through the legal process to form the corporation. There needs to be a plan to raise funds, and then the founders need to execute on that plan. This divides the company into an embryonic stage, formative stage, and a building stage. In the embryonic stage, the founders work on the fit. Basically, what does it take to do a startup, and is it the right thing for them? In the formative stage, the founders focus on building the right foundation for the startup. The corporation needs to be formed with an eye towards future fundraising, and certain contracts need to be put in place. Finally, in the build stage, the founders focus on the startup's fundability. In this journey, the founders should start working on the funding strategy after the corporate foundation has been set. Most founders have a follow-the-herd mentality when it comes to fundraising, which means they just look at where they are at in their journey, like raising a seed round, and do what every other startup does when they raise seed rounds. If the average startup raised $1 million in seed money, then you do the same. Unfortunately, it's not one size fits all, and taking this lazy approach usually results in raising the wrong amount. The right way to raise funds is to build a funding strategy, which consists of 4 components: funding approach, funding sources, funding vehicles, and funding targets. Together, they answer 6 key questions. When should you raise funds? Why should you time your fundraise this way? How much should you raise? From where should you raise? What type of funds, and funds from whom? Let's begin with when to raise funds. This graph shows how a healthy startup grows its value over time. It's a stair step and not a smooth curve. It's important to raise funds after the company reaches an inflection point, which is a measurable milestone that dramatically increases its value. The inflection points are the red diamonds on the graph. The right time to raise money would be the green rectangles immediately after the red diamonds. Why is it important to raise funds after reaching an inflection point? Because raising funds at the peak of the company's value increases the founder's leverage to seek optimal valuation and terms. So if there's a best time to raise funds, there's also a worst time to raise funds, and that would be right before you reach an inflection point. If you don't understand your inflection points, there's a high risk of raising funds at the wrong time for your company. So, how much should you raise? Founders need to raise enough money to get them past the next inflection point. Let's say you just hit your first inflection point. You are now ready to raise your pre-seed funds. The amount you raise should be enough to go past the next inflection point, at which time you would raise your seed funds, which needs to be enough to get you past the next inflection point, at which time you would raise your Series A funds, and the process continues. Once again, this means you must know where your inflection points are. So, the funding approach is built on inflection points, which there are 4 types: product, sales and marketing, business development, and intellectual property. Within each category, there are multiple subcategories. Startups need to determine which categories and subcategories of inflection points are most applicable to their business and revenue model. For each inflection point, founders need to determine the time and cost required. You aggregate the bottoms-up data into high-level funding milestones. These fundraising milestones provide a forward-looking funding path. Because you've built this using bottoms-up data, you can have a high degree of confidence in your funding roadmap. This is just a quick overview. If you want the full story, check out our 4-hour funding strategy class on our website, fundablestartups.com.